She didn't have the nerves to fly an Apache. Get on the ground. That was the sentence they threw straight in Sarah Thompson's face, right in the middle of the Nevada desert, just as she took off her flight helmet, her hands still shaking from the wind and sand. One officer sneered. A dirty report was hastily written, and a red mark was ready to be stamped onto her career. They thought the story ended there, but just a few seconds later, in what seemed like a meaningless moment, a video recording was quietly sent to the highest level. There were no tears, no excuses, only cold data, and a flight so perfect it could not be twisted. And then the reversal happened. The man who watched that footage was not just any officer. It was Admiral James Harlan, a living legend of the United States Air Force. He rewound it, watched it again, then picked up the phone and asked a single question. Who is that pilot? If you were Sarah, buried alive by the system because of prejudice, used as a smokescreen for those abusing their power, would you choose silence to survive, or stand up to expose the truth, even if it meant losing everything? If this story makes you feel angry, feels familiar, or feels like you see yourself in it, press subscribe to the channel right now, and leave a comment to tell me, what would you do when the entire system wants you to disappear? Sarah Thompson grew up in a small town in western Texas, where the sky was so vast that children became accustomed to the sound of rotor blades as part of everyday life. War did not appear through guns or medals, but through the long absence of a father who never returned. In her home, memories of him existed through old photographs, briefly retold stories, and a silent discipline that covered every daily routine. Her father was a pilot during the Second World War, missing after a mission that the military acknowledged with only a few official lines. There was no full explanation, no details, only a void that stretched across Sarah's entire childhood. On summer afternoons, she often stood near a makeshift airfield not far from home, watching helicopters lift off and disappear beyond the horizon. Once, when she was still young, she asked her mother why her father chose to fly into the sky instead of staying on the ground. Her mother was silent for a moment, then said that her father believed in a way of living, and he had lived true to it. The answer explained little, but it stayed with Sarah for a very long time. As she grew older, the memory of her father gradually turned into a familiar voice in her head, sounding every time she looked up at the sky. Flying is not to prove anything. Flying is to survive. That sentence became a principle, not a slogan, and it shaped her dream clear persistently. In the early 1990s, Sarah joined the military. On the day she entered the training center, she carried a spotless civilian flight record, near-perfect academic scores, and a calm demeanor that others found hard to read. In tests, she did not stand out through showmanship, but through precision. When placed into complex simulated scenarios, she responded quickly and cleanly, with no wasted movement. One training officer once looked at her results and asked where she had learned those skills. Sarah replied that she learned them from simulators, from books, and from never allowing herself to overlook details. The answer was plain, but memorable. Her file was rated outstanding. During the final classification session, the selection officer flipped through each page, paused at the remarks section, and said in an even tone that Apache required pilots who handled pressure better. Sarah asked what kind of pressure her results had failed to reflect. The officer looked up and replied that the pressure of Apache did not exist only in tests. We need someone more suitable. The sentence was placed at the end of the exchange, like a door closing before it ever opened. The assignment list was released a few days later. Sarah's name appeared under Black Hawk Pilot. As she walked out of the briefing room, a male colleague passed by, glanced at the list, and smirked. Black Hawk suits you better. Fewer life and death decisions. The remark was delivered lightly, as if casual, but it was enough to draw a line. Sarah did not respond. She was used to the system, deciding where she belonged, and arguments rarely changed that. Black Hawk placed her on transport, resupply, and medical evacuation missions. These were long, heavy flights, rarely mentioned, yet essential to keeping every unit functioning. She carried soldiers from staging areas to the front line, evacuated wounded personnel from danger zones, and transported cargo that, if delayed, could jeopardize entire operations. The work was critical, but often treated as secondary. During one mission briefing, when Sarah proposed adjusting the flight route to shorten response time in emergencies, a senior officer looked at her and said bluntly that they did not risk multi-million-dollar assets based on emotions. We do not fly by feeling. The way he emphasized each word made the room feel heavy. Sarah took notes and confirmed the orders in a steady voice. She understood that the remark was not aimed only at the proposal, but at her. Sarah's first flights went smoothly. She followed procedures, but not mechanically. She learned to read weather through subtle shifts in the wind, command, to feel the helicopter through vibrations traveling up the controls. Co-pilots gradually adapted to her working rhythm, a rhythm that was stable and predictable. Some said that flying with her made them feel more at ease, because every situation was handled early. Sarah simply nodded. To her, it was self-evident and needed no explanation. After each mission, once post-flight checks were complete, she often passed by the parking area where Apache helicopters rested in silence. Their dark frames and heavy silhouettes were nothing like the Black Hawk. A technician once joked that Apache was for people who liked risk. Sarah thought otherwise. To her, Apache was not a symbol of recklessness, but of responsibility placed in the hands of those capable of carrying it. She never stood there long, but long enough to recognize the distance between what she was doing and what she had been trained to do. During periodic evaluations, Sarah's record remained spotless. No technical errors, no disciplinary violations, no negative feedback. A young officer once asked why she did not continue submitting transfer requests. Sarah replied that she had submitted them and that her file was exactly where the system allowed it to be. The answer left the officer silent. In the military, some questions required no further explanation. Sarah continued to fly, continued to complete missions, continued to keep everything moving at the proper rhythm. But each time she saw Apache resting on the tarmac, she understood that the door had been locked in advance, not because she lacked ability, but because decisions had been made before she ever entered the evaluation room. The conflict did not erupt immediately. It accumulated quietly between real capability and unspoken bias, between the numbers in a file and how they were interpreted. One night, as Sarah was rechecking equipment after a flight shift, the alarm sounded urgently. The lights in the hangar switched to emergency red. An announcement echoed through the speakers, ordering flight crews to prepare immediately for an evacuation mission. Information was scarce, only that the situation was unexpected and outside standard safety doctrine. Sarah lifted her head, feeling her heartbeat change. She moved quickly toward the helicopter, her mind holding only one clear thought. Some nights force a choice, and that choice leaves a mark long after the rotors stop turning. Night fell quickly over the base, bringing with it the dry, cold characteristic of the desert. Sarah had just finished a technical check when the alarm siren blared, its rapid sound cutting through every unfinished thought. Emergency lights snapped on, bathing the helicopter hangar in a harsh yellow glow. A voice came over the loudspeaker, ordering a Black Hawk flight crew to be ready immediately for a nighttime evacuation mission. The information was transmitted briefly. A combat zone had become unstable, and a group of soldiers needed to be extracted from a dangerous area along a pre-approved route. Sarah moved quickly toward the helicopter, put on her flight helmet, and climbed into the cockpit with motions that had long since become reflex. The co-pilot sat down beside her and rechecked the communication systems. As the rotors began to spin, the atmosphere inside the cabin sealed off, leaving only the engine noise and the glow from the control panels. The helicopter lifted off, leaving the runway behind in the darkness, following the route that had been planned. The radio crackled through the night, the commander's voice clear and steady. Maintain the flight path, no adjustments. The order was repeated twice, as if to ensure that no misunderstanding could occur. Sarah acknowledged the command, holding a steady altitude, her eyes sweeping across the navigation display and digital map. Everything was proceeding according to plan, exactly the way the system expected. As the helicopter moved deeper into the combat zone, the radio signal began to distort slightly. On a secondary screen, a blinking point of light appeared, and then vanished. Sarah leaned forward, adjusting her angle of view. On the ground, among rocks and shadows, she recognized a faint distress signal. A group of infantry soldiers was trapped, their position offset from the approved flight route. They were not on the original evacuation list. Sarah reduced speed slightly and observed more closely. Through the scope, she saw slow-moving figures, some of them being supported by others. Vital signals flickered, unstable and weak. The co-pilot turned toward her, his voice tense. "Do we have orders?" The question was asked quickly, but it was enough to clarify the situation. There was no medevac in this area, and their Black Hawk was the closest aircraft. Sarah tightened her grip on the controls, her eyes fixed on the display. She calculated the distance, fuel, and time to reach them. If she continued along the route, the soldiers would be left behind. If she diverted, she would be violating a direct order. Sarah replied, her voice low but firm. "If we keep flying, they die. The statement was not an argument, merely a cold assessment based on the data in front of her. The radio came alive again, this time more urgently. Thompson, repeat, return to the route. The commander's voice was no longer even, carrying a clear warning. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands still steady on the controls. She acknowledged that she had heard the order, but did not immediately change course. In that brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. She thought of training flights, psychological evaluations, and a sentence that had echoed in her mind for a long time: fly to survive, and to let others survive. Sarah turned off course. The helicopter banked slightly, descending into a darker area where the terrain was rough and unpredictable. The co-pilot looked at her but said nothing more, focusing on his task. Stray gunfire echoed from a distance, flashes of light tearing through the night. Sarah kept her speed just right, avoiding heavy fire zones, guiding the helicopter down toward the soldier's position. When the landing gear touched the ground, the cabin door opened. The wounded soldiers were brought aboard quickly. Blood spread across the metal floor, mixing with dust and the sharp smell of gunpowder. A young soldier grabbed Sarah's hand as he was pulled in, his eyes panicked at first, then gradually calming as he realized he was safe. No one said thank you at that moment. Everyone understood that time was the only thing left. The helicopter lifted off again, leaving the area while sporadic fire still came from the ground. Sarah brought the aircraft up to a safe altitude and headed toward the rally point. Throughout the flight, the radio remained unnaturally silent. No further orders, no questions. That silence weighed heavier than any shouted command. When the helicopter landed back at the base, the medical team was already waiting, quickly taking the wounded away. Sarah removed her flight helmet, sweat soaking her hair. She stood beside the helicopter, looking at the cabin floor where bloodstains had not yet been cleaned. The co-pilot stepped closer and said quietly that at least they had saved them. Sarah nodded without answering. She knew the cost of her decision had not yet been fully accounted for. The radio in the command room came on. The commander's voice rang out, cold and concise. "You have just ended your own career." There was no yelling, no argument, just a statement delivered like a conclusion. Sarah stood still, hearing every word clearly. She did not protest or try to explain. Everything had already happened, and the system would respond in its familiar way. A few hours later, when all procedures were complete, Sarah was called into the administrative office. Her file lay on the desk, thickened by new reports. An administrative officer read the decision aloud, his voice flat, like someone reading a technical document. Sarah's record was marked in red, with a clearly printed remark: unsuitable for high-pressure missions. The phrase was stamped, without any lengthy explanation. Sarah looked at those words for a few seconds. She understood their meaning, not only for the mission that had just occurred, but for her entire path ahead. That red mark did not say she was technically wrong, nor did it say she had committed a serious disciplinary violation. It only said that she was no longer compatible with the way the system wanted to operate in situations where human lives and procedures did not align. She signed the report, returned the pen, and left the room. The corridor was empty, fluorescent lights casting a cold glow on the floor. Sarah walked slowly, clearly feeling the change that had just taken place. Her decision had saved lives, but it had also closed a door she once believed she could walk through on her own ability alone. In that moment, she did not think about the distant future. She only knew that some choices cannot be undone, and their price is always paid in a way that those involved are rarely allowed to negotiate. The decision was made quickly and cleanly, the way the system always handled cases it did not want to prolong. The following morning, Sarah was called into the administrative office, where the white lighting made everything look flat and cold. The administrative officer opened the file and read each line in an even voice, carrying no personal emotion. When he finished, he looked up and stated clearly that she was grounded indefinitely. The phrase was spoken slowly, as if to avoid any possibility of misunderstanding. Sarah listened and gave a slight nod. "Understood," she replied briefly. "By the book." There were no follow-up questions, and no further explanations. The decision had been signed before she ever stepped into the room. When the meeting ended, she stood, saluted according to regulation, and left. The door closed behind her, leaving the room with its thick files and a procedure that had just completed its intended function. Out in the hallway, a few people watched her go. Some avoided her gaze, some were curious, and some muttered words just quiet enough to still be heard. "At least she still has a job." The comment was delivered half joking, half serious, as a way of reassuring oneself that everything had been handled properly. Sarah kept walking, without turning back. She had heard enough to understand her new position within the unit. The logistics work began immediately after that. No more cockpit, no more familiar engine noise, replaced instead by warehouses, manifests, and long shifts under fluorescent lights. Sarah performed exactly the tasks assigned to her, checking data, signing off, and coordinating transport. Everything ran smoothly, much like her Black Hawk flights in the past, except that the sky was now out of reach. Some thought that keeping her in the system was a concession. Sarah understood that it was the safest way to remove her. In the evenings, when the base quieted down, she returned to the simulator room. The room was empty, lit only by the glow of the screens reflecting off the equipment. No one required her to do this, and there was no official schedule. Sarah powered up the simulator and selected the most complex scenarios: loss of communication in bad weather, engine failure at low altitude, sudden ground fire. She placed herself in situations where the smallest mistake would lead to serious consequences. Each time a simulation ended, she recorded reaction times, decisions made, and points that required adjustment. There were nights when she stayed late, after most of the hallway lights had been turned off. A technician passing by once asked if she was waiting for someone. Sarah replied that she was finishing an exercise. The technician nodded and did not ask further. In that room, Sarah rediscovered a familiar rhythm, where every decision was based on data and discipline, rather than on how others perceived her. Alongside the simulations, Sarah underwent periodic psychological evaluations. The questions were carefully phrased, focusing on her responses under stress, her ability to control emotion, and her level of compliance with orders. She answered honestly, without trying to adjust her responses to meet expectations. The results came back clean, just as they had before. The evaluator remarked that she was more stable than many pilots currently flying. The remark was not entered into the official record, but Sarah remembered it. Time passed, and her absence from the air gradually became normal to those around her. Some believed she had accepted her new role. Some believed she would soon leave the service. Sarah offered no explanations. She continued her daytime duties and continued training when night fell. At times, in the simulator room, she would pause for a few seconds, staring at the darkened screen, recalling the sensation of controlling a helicopter in the air. That feeling had never left her. It had only been set aside. A young officer once stopped by the simulator room and saw her running a complex scenario. He asked why she continued to train when she was no longer flying. Sarah replied that skill does not disappear simply because it is no longer used. The answer left him silent for a moment before he wished her a good evening. When he left, Sarah resumed her exercise, as if the conversation had never happened. In the months that followed, she retook the full range of technical evaluations, from basic to advanced. She made no effort to submit the results to her superiors, nor did she request a review of the grounding decision. What she was doing was not meant to persuade anyone. It was the only way for her to keep herself in a state of readiness. If one day the system was forced to reopen a door it had closed, she wanted to be certain she stood at the front, not the back. A year passed, slowly and steadily. During that time, combat intensity increased in other units. News of a shortage of Apache pilots began to surface in closed meetings. Sarah caught fragments of information while transferring files while signing off on urgent deployments. Old names were mentioned again, and files once pushed aside were brought back for review. No one spoke openly, but the atmosphere on the base changed. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing her logistics work, an officer called her over and asked whether she was still maintaining flight physical standards. Sarah replied that she was. The officer nodded, wrote something down, and said that the system was reviewing several veteran files. The statement was delivered as a general notice, but to Sarah, it carried a different meaning. She understood that what she had done in silence over the past year might soon be weighed. That evening, Sarah returned to the simulator room. She reran an old scenario, this time at a higher speed and with greater demands. When the results appeared, the metrics matched levels that previously only active pilots had achieved. Sarah looked at the screen for a few seconds, then shut the system down. She did not smile, nor did she show excitement. To her, this was simply the next step in preparation. Somewhere within the machine, old files were being reopened. Decisions once considered final were beginning to be questioned, not out of sympathy, but out of practical necessity. Sarah left the simulator room and stepped into the dark hallway, clearly aware of one thing: she was not waiting for an opportunity. She had prepared long enough that when it arrived, no one would be able to easily refuse her. If you have ever been cast aside not because of a lack of ability but because of bias, keep going. The next part is when the system is forced to look back. The deployment order arrived unexpectedly, placed on Sarah's desk late one dry, sweltering afternoon. There was no lengthy explanation, only a request that she report to a training site in Nevada to take part in a special flight evaluation. The attached file was so brief that she immediately understood this was not a routine check. There was no program code, no name for the evaluation, and no note indicating where the results would be recorded. Sarah read the order again, then folded it and slipped it into her pocket. She had waited long enough to understand that opportunities rarely came in a clearly defined form. The Nevada desert greeted her with searing dry heat and wind carrying fine sand. On the tarmac, Apache helicopters lay motionless, their dark fuselages heavy and silent, like hunting beasts waiting for a command. Sarah stepped out of the vehicle, sunlight striking directly against the visor of the flight helmet in her hand. There were no flags, no welcoming formation, and no opening speech. Everything had been arranged to the bare minimum, just enough to allow something to take place without leaving many traces behind. The on-site commander was Major Victor Kane. He stood a few steps away from Sarah, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe as if assessing an unwanted piece of merchandise. Kane had a weathered face, sun-darkened skin, and a low, dry voice. He did not bother with a long introduction. He simply looked straight at Sarah and said that he disliked experiments. The way he stressed the final word made the air around them feel heavier. Sarah stood upright, holding a regulation stance. She waited for what would come next, not speaking first. Kane continued, his tone making no effort to hide his disdain. He said that women had no place on an Apache. The statement was delivered as if it were an obvious fact, requiring no proof. A few members of the technical crew nearby exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Sarah replied briefly and clearly. Understood. She added nothing, offered no explanation, and made no rebuttal. She understood that any words at this moment could be used as grounds for a conclusion before the evaluation even began. Kane raised an eyebrow, as if disappointed that he had not received the reaction he was expecting. He turned to the training team and ordered them to make the test more realistic. His voice carried an unspoken meaning that everyone present understood. As Sarah walked toward the designated Apache, Kane leaned close to his assistant and spoke quietly enough not to carry. He said that she would break. The remark was not a prediction, but sounded more like a conclusion already reached. The assistant nodded and began adjusting parameters on the mission simulation system. On the screen, additional risk factors were introduced, from simulated hostile fire to abnormal situations that would not normally appear in a standard evaluation. Sarah climbed into the cockpit, set her helmet aside, and checked the instrument panel. The familiar smell of metal and engine oil calmed her. She placed her hand on the control stick, feeling the responsiveness of the system. In that moment, the months grounded, the long nights in the simulator, and every worst-case scenario she had forced herself to imagine all became useful. The co-pilot assigned to the evaluation took his seat, glanced at her, then nodded, saying little. The engine started, a deep, powerful sound spreading across the tarmac. The Apache vibrated lightly as the rotors began to spin. Sarah contacted ground control and confirmed the initial parameters. Kane replied curtly, instructing her to take off according to the established scenario. There was no wish of good luck and no encouragement. The helicopter lifted from the ground, rising into a cloud of sand drawn up by the wind. At first, the evaluation unfolded like an ordinary training session. Sarah maintained a steady altitude, following the marked checkpoints. On the display, a simulated scenario appeared. A special operations team required air support. Kane ordered her to fly low, enter fast, and exit fast. His voice came through the radio, sharp and rapid, as if deliberately pushing the tempo higher than necessary. Sarah followed the orders, adjusting her heading and reducing altitude. As the Apache approached the simulated area, the warning system began to signal. The co-pilot reported simulated fire from a hillside. Sarah acknowledged, altered the flight path to avoid the danger zone, while keeping close enough to support the team on the ground. She could clearly feel the pressure increasing, but every maneuver remained within her control. Kane did not stop. He demanded additional scenarios, his voice pressing forward. On the screen, a simulated missile appeared, heading straight toward the Apache. The co-pilot announced that the distance was closing rapidly. Sarah reacted immediately, changing altitude and direction, pulling the helicopter out of the dangerous trajectory. She heard Kane give a soft chuckle over the radio, as if waiting for the moment she would make a mistake. The desert wind intensified, blowing sand that obscured visibility. Sarah reduced speed, relying on instruments rather than her eyes. She positioned the Apache optimally, creating a safe corridor for the simulated special operations team to withdraw. On the ground, indicators showed the mission progressing. Everything was happening fast and under strain, but not beyond her ability to manage. Kane continued to raise the difficulty. He signaled the training team to make further adjustments, pushing the evaluation beyond its original purpose. Sarah's co-pilot reported light signal interference. Sarah acknowledged and requested a check of the backup communication channel. In that moment, she realized this was no longer a fair test. This was a deliberate attempt to push her into failure. As the Apache flew at low altitude, preparing to change course, the radio suddenly fell silent. The familiar voices vanished, leaving only the sound of the engine and the whistle of the wind outside. The co-pilot looked at Sarah and reported that they had lost contact with the ground. Sarah tried switching channels and adjusting the system, but received no response. On the display, the indicators continued to run, but the commander's voice was gone. Suspended in the air, in the heat and sand of the Nevada desert, Sarah realized that the evaluation had just entered a different phase. There were no more instructions and no safety net. She held the control stick steady, eyes fixed on the instrument panel, while the silence on the radio stretched on, second by second, signaling that what came next would no longer be called training. The silence on the radio stretched on for a few more seconds, long enough for Sarah to understand that the evaluation had been pushed into a different state. There was no longer a commanding voice giving instructions, no familiar rhythm of control from the ground. There was only the sound of the engine, the whistling wind, and the numbers constantly shifting on the control panel. The co-pilot turned to look at her, waiting for an order. Sarah kept her hand on the control stick, made a slight adjustment to maintain a stable altitude, then requested a full check of all backup communication channels. The radio suddenly came back to life, this time with Kane's voice sounding sharper and harsher than before. He made no effort to hide his agitation, shouting directly into the system, "Handle it, pilot." The words were thrown out like a final command, without any accompanying technical guidance. Sarah realized that Kane was waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for a panicked reaction to turn the entire evaluation into evidence to eliminate her permanently. The desert wind intensified abnormally, alternating streams of hot and cold air interweaving and causing the Apache to shake noticeably. Sand and dust were swept upward, completely obscuring the forward view. On the display screen, altitude and speed indicators fluctuated rapidly. The co-pilot reported that they were gradually losing direct visual contact. Sarah ordered a switch to fully instrument-based flight, kept her breathing steady, and focused on every parameter. This was a scenario she had run dozens of times in the simulator, with the only difference being that this time, everything was real. A warning sounded, sharp and brief. On the screen, a simulated signal appeared, moving at high speed. The assistant shouted that a simulated missile was closing in. The distance dropped so quickly that the co-pilot had to repeat the alert. Sarah reacted instantly, pulling the control stick and changing altitude and heading in one seamless motion. The Apache banked hard, the rotors shrieking through the dense air. The simulated missile streaked past, close enough for the warning system to switch to red. Kane scoffed over the radio. "See? That's pressure." His voice carried clear satisfaction, as if every dangerous situation that had just occurred were proof reinforcing his prejudice. Sarah did not respond. She did not devote even a fraction of her focus to that voice. Everything she did in that moment was directed toward keeping the Apache and the simulated people on the ground from falling into an irreversible situation. On the mission display, the position of the simulated special operations team began to change. The simulation system pushed them into an area surrounded by multiple directions, with simulated fire points appearing more densely. The co-pilot reported that if they held their current position, the team on the ground would be trapped. Sarah quickly assessed the options, calculating approach angles and reaction times. Kane continued to press her, demanding that she fly lower and faster, as if trying to drag the Apache into the most dangerous zone possible. Sarah adjusted the flight path, lowering altitude within allowable limits. She kept the Apache positioned just close enough to apply fire pressure on the simulated ambush points, and just far enough to avoid entering a dangerous trajectory. Dust continued to blur everything, but the indicators on the screen remained clear. The co-pilot reported that the special operations team now had a chance to withdraw, but the window was very short. Sarah slightly increased speed, maintained a steady rhythm, and created a safe corridor during those critical seconds. Another warning sounded, this time from behind. The assistant announced that an additional simulated threat had been activated. Sarah tilted her head, glanced at a secondary screen, then adjusted her position again. She guided the Apache into a narrow trajectory, using the simulated terrain to shield the team on the ground. In that moment, every movement she made became so precise it was almost automatic. The months grounded, the long nights in the simulator, all of it converged here. Kane continued issuing rapid-fire orders, his voice growing more strained with each one. He demanded more scenarios, more pressure, as if testing where Sarah's limits truly lay. But the more difficulty increased, the cleaner her responses became. There were no wasted movements, no rushed decisions. The co-pilot looked at her differently now, the tension in his voice gradually easing as he saw that everything remained under control. Finally, on the screen, a signal indicated that the simulated special operations team had withdrawn from the danger zone. The simulated mission was complete. Sarah brought the Apache up to a safe altitude, held a steady speed, and waited for the next instruction. The radio was silent for a few seconds. Then Kane spoke, his voice lower, lacking the earlier sense of triumph. He ordered the evaluation to end and instructed them to return to the landing point. When the Apache touched down, sand and dust billowed up and then quickly settled. The engine throttled down, the rotors slowing. Sarah removed her flight helmet, took a deep breath, and felt her heart rate gradually stabilize. The co-pilot turned to her and quietly said that the flight data looked very good. Sarah nodded but did not reply. She knew that technical results were only part of the story. In the ground control room, Kane stood in front of a large screen displaying the flight data. Graph lines were clearly visible, with no significant deviations. Reaction time, precision, fuel consumption, everything fell within optimal limits. Kane slammed his hand down on the table, exclaiming that it was impossible. Several technical officers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Data was data, and it did not care about anyone's prejudice. Kane turned away and signaled the end of the evaluation. He did not speak directly to Sarah when she stepped down from the cockpit. Instead, he returned to his office, sat down at his desk, and began writing the preliminary report. Lines of text appeared on the screen, emphasizing risk factors and reframing certain situations in a negative light. He wrote that high pressure could lead to future errors, that Sarah's reactions, though effective, carried latent risk. Each sentence was carefully chosen to produce a familiar conclusion. Outside, Sarah left the landing area and walked slowly toward the temporary housing. She did not know the contents of the report being written, but she understood the system well enough to anticipate it. Even when flight data appeared flawless, the final decision could still be guided by the will of the person holding the pen. As the office door closed behind Kane, the tension did not end. It had only shifted into another form, quieter, more dangerous, and waiting for the next turning point. The flight recording was sent out during the night, mixed in among a flood of routine technical reports and training data. It was not marked urgent, nor was it accompanied by any explanation beyond basic parameters. In the system, it was just another file, a sequence of numbers and images to be archived, categorized, and potentially forgotten if no one deliberately stopped to look closely. But this time, the recording did not stop at the usual desks. It was forwarded, passed through multiple levels and signatures, until it was placed on the desk of someone who rarely reviewed such material personally. James Harlan sat alone in his spacious office, the yellow light casting down onto the dark wooden desk. He was accustomed to summary reports, to pre-written conclusions where data often served merely to illustrate decisions already shaped in advance. When the file was opened, he did not watch it immediately. He read the brief annotation, skimmed the parameters, and only then pressed play. The screen filled with images from the Apache cockpit, vibrating slightly with the movement of the rotor blades. Harlan watched from beginning to end, missing no detail. When the recording ended, he did not turn off the screen. He rewound it, this time more slowly, stopping at moments that someone who had never flown would consider ordinary. He studied how the helicopter changed altitude, the timing of the pilot's course adjustments before the warning sounded. The numbers running across the screen were not inert data to him. To Harlan, they resembled heartbeats, reflexes, and a human being's ability to remain calm under real pressure. He rewound it, focusing on the segment where the system registered a sudden increase in risk. There were no signs of panic, no unnecessary movements. Everything happened at the right moment, precisely as needed. Harlan leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. He had flown long enough, had witnessed enough accidents to know that the safest flights rarely impressed outsiders. They left behind only accurate numbers and a familiar sense that everything had been handled correctly. The next morning, Just as the sun rose, the phone in the command room in Nevada rang. The sound echoed through the otherwise quiet space, where Victor Kane stood in front of the planning board, reviewing the report he had completed the night before. Kane picked up the receiver, his voice retaining its familiar firmness. On the other end of the line, a deep, measured voice spoke without introduction. The question was short and direct. "Who is that pilot?" Kane hesitated for a very brief moment. He glanced at the officers around him, then answered with the name Sarah Thompson, including her rank and current file status. There was no immediate response from the other end. The silence lasted a few seconds, long enough for Kane to sense something outside his expectations. He began to explain, emphasizing the risk factors he had noted in the report, speaking about high pressure and the potential for future errors. Harlan let Kane finish without interrupting. Only when Kane stopped did he speak. His voice was not loud, but it was clear, each word placed precisely. He said that he had watched the entire recording, reviewed the accompanying data, and that he did not find what Kane was describing. He paused briefly, then continued, the sentence delivered slowly, like a conclusion that required no debate. "She is the best Apache pilot I have ever evaluated." In the command room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Kane stood motionless, gripping the phone more tightly. His face paled, not from fear, but from realizing that the authority had just slipped out of his hands. Harlan continued, saying that if a pilot like that was to be grounded, he wanted to know the official reason. He instructed Kane to resend the entire file, unedited, with no additional personal commentary. The call ended cleanly, leaving no space for reaction. Kane set the phone down and stared at the screen in front of him. The lines of text in the report he had just written seemed to lose their weight. A technical officer standing nearby asked whether any adjustments were needed. Kane did not respond immediately. He understood that every attempt he had made to steer the conclusion had been blocked by something beyond his control. Recognition from someone standing above all intermediary layers. The news spread faster than Kane would have liked. Within a few hours, new orders were drafted. Sarah was summoned to the command room, this time not to hear a decision of elimination. The officer reading the orders kept a neutral tone, but the content was entirely different from what she had grown accustomed to hearing. She was reclassified and officially admitted into the Apache program. There was no lengthy explanation. No apology, only a change of status in the system. Sarah listened and nodded when asked to acknowledge. She did not appear surprised, nor did she display clear emotion. When she signed the record, her hand was steady, just as it had been when signing logistics reports in the past. A young officer standing nearby glanced at her, his gaze mixed with curiosity and respect. Sarah left the room and stepped into the corridor, where light streamed through the tall windows. She understood that this was not a victory in the usual sense. It was a door opened by data and capability, not by sympathy. The reclassification proceeded quickly. Intensive training sessions began, with a high tempo and strict demands. Sarah integrated into the program as if she had been there for a long time. What she had prepared during the period she was grounded now became a solid foundation. The instructors recognized it, even if they did not say it aloud. To them, Sarah was not a special case, but a pilot who met exactly what the Apache required. Not long afterward, the next deployment order was issued. Afghanistan appeared on the planning board, accompanied by brief notes about high mountains, narrow valleys, and complex flight conditions. Sarah read the mission information, clearly sensing the shift from controlled evaluations to real war. There, data was no longer a simulation, and every decision carried consequences that could not be undone. When she climbed into the Apache for her first flight in the new area, there was no welcoming speech. No one revisited the story in Nevada. Her teammates looked at her as they would any other pilot on the crew, judging her by her composure and the way she checked every detail before takeoff. Sarah put on her helmet, placed her hand on the controls, and felt the familiar vibration travel up her arms. Beneath the rotor blades, the mountains of Afghanistan stretched out, narrow valleys opening like deep grooves. This was a place where a single second of error could turn into a funeral, where trust came not from words, but from everyone being alive when they returned. As the Apache lifted off the ground, Sarah guided the aircraft into the air thick with dust and wind. She knew that from this moment on, the story would no longer revolve around prejudice or reports. It would revolve around the raw truth of war and the cost of trust paid with every decision made in the air. The next part will no longer be about prejudice, but about the raw truth of war and trust paid for in blood. Afghanistan appeared unlike any simulation Sarah had ever experienced. From above, steep mountain ranges sliced across the sky. Narrow valleys opened like deep cuts, where the wind constantly shifted. A.N.D. radio signals rarely stayed stable for more than a few minutes. This was not a space to prove anything. This was a place where every deviation carried the price of human lives. As Sarah's Apache entered its first operational area, she clearly felt the difference between training and real war. Everything happened faster, harsher, with no room for half measures. The military convoy below moved slowly through a narrow mountain pass, flanked on both sides by towering slopes and jagged rock formations. From the cockpit, Sarah saw armored vehicles moving in a tight line, the distance between each kept to an absolute minimum. The radio crackled with long stretches of interference, like metal grinding continuously against metal. Communication channels shifted back and forth, sometimes clear, sometimes fading, making information exchange tense and unreliable. The co-pilot reported that signals from the ground unit were weakening. Suddenly, a shout broke through the radio, mixed with static but clear enough to make the cockpit go silent. "We're pinned down." The words came out rushed, followed by gunfire and overlapping shouts. Sarah immediately dropped altitude, guiding the Apache closer to the engagement zone. She responded, her voice steady and clear. "Hold formation. I'm handling it." The short statement carried no emotion, but it was enough for the ground team to know they had been heard. Flashes of fire erupted from the mountainside, anti-aircraft rounds shooting upward along unpredictable trajectories. The co-pilot tensed, reporting that the distance was closing rapidly. "We're too close," he said, eyes fixed on the indicators. Sarah quickly scanned the control panel, assessing speed, altitude, and wind direction. She adjusted the flight path, dropping the Apache even lower, hugging the terrain. "Close is the only way they won't dare lift their heads," she said, as if stating something obvious. The Apache dove in, holding a tight trajectory between the mountain slopes. The roar of the engines echoed through the valley, applying constant pressure to firing positions below. Sarah adjusted the main weapon system with precision, firing short, controlled bursts, focused on points marked earlier by ground reconnaissance teams. There was no haste in her movements. Every decision was driven by data and experience, not by panicked reflex. The co-pilot followed each command closely, his voice gradually steadying as he realized Sarah's control rhythm did not waver, even as the situation intensified. Under sustained aerial pressure, enemy fire thinned out. Tracer lines became scattered, then stopped altogether. The convoy seized the moment to accelerate, clearing the danger zone. A medical evacuation helicopter appeared at the edge of the valley, waiting for a safe signal. Sarah held the Apache in a shielding position, creating enough space for the evacuation helicopter to descend and load the wounded. As it lifted off, carrying the injured out of the valley, Sarah brought the Apache higher, maintaining pressure until the entire convoy had exited the area. When the mission ended, no one spoke immediately. Inside the cockpit, only the engine noise remained, along with breathing that had slowly returned to normal. The co-pilot looked at Sarah, his expression entirely different from before. There were no words of praise, no need for confirmation. They had just passed through a situation where a delay of even a few seconds would have led to a different outcome. That silence was its own form of acknowledgement. Back at base, Sarah landed the Apache with her familiar precision. The rotors slowed, and dust settled. A few unit members nearby watched quietly. After completing post-flight checks, Sarah stepped out of the cockpit and removed her helmet. A medical officer passed by, nodded at her, and said the wounded had been evacuated safely. Sarah responded with a brief nod. To her, the mission's outcome spoke for itself. In the days that followed, similar missions repeated at high intensity, escorting convoys through hazardous routes, supporting medical evacuation helicopters in poor weather, and applying enough pressure to prevent enemy counterattacks. Sarah did not try to distinguish herself. She did exactly what an Apache pilot was meant to do: maintain a steady flight rhythm, make clear decisions, and withdraw once the mission was complete. Her teammates gradually adjusted how they viewed her. Trust was formed not through words, but through the fact that they kept returning to base after every flight. During a post-mission briefing, maps were spread across the table, marked with the routes they had flown. Sarah stood with the pilot group, listening to the commander's analysis. As routes were reviewed, her gaze stopped on a newly added flight path on the map. That route offered no clear tactical advantage, nor did it shorten response time. It only slightly altered the trajectory compared to what they had previously flown. Sarah asked for the reason behind the adjustment. An officer replied that it was a new directive, intended to optimize movement flow. The explanation sounded reasonable, but it was not convincing. She reviewed the data, compared it with prior missions, and realized the change did not stem from any real operational need on the battlefield. It felt like a decision made elsewhere, for a purpose that did not appear on the tactical map. The briefing continued, but Sarah was no longer fully focused on what was being said. In her mind, the image of that route became sharply defined, along with a familiar sensation she had felt before, when things began to drift away from mission logic. She said nothing more and did not raise further questions publicly. Experience had taught her that some things needed closer observation before being brought into the light. As she left the briefing room, Sarah walked more slowly than usual. Outside, the sound of another helicopter's engines rose, blending with the dry, cold mountain wind. She paused briefly, looking toward the runway, where Apache helicopters were preparing for the next mission. War here did not exist only in the air or on the ground. It also lived in small decisions, seemingly harmless adjustments, and flight paths redrawn for reasons left unspoken. Sarah turned away and headed back to the technical area to prepare for the next mission. On the surface, everything continued to function normally, but somewhere within the system, a change had begun, subtle and difficult to detect, and she knew that sooner or later, that change would force her to face another choice, no less dangerous than what she had just endured in the skies over Afghanistan. After many weeks of continuous flying, the rhythm of life at the Afghanistan base gradually became familiar to Sarah. Escort missions, fire support runs, and long duty shifts under harsh conditions made time pass differently, measured not by days or hours, but by the number of times the aircraft returned safely. It was precisely within that repetition that small details began to surface, not loud, not sudden, but enough for someone accustomed to reading the sky and data to sense that something was drifting off its normal course. On a rare free evening, Sarah spread flight maps across her desk. The light fell on routes crisscrossing mountains and valleys. She used a pen to mark recent missions, comparing them with weather data and threat levels. When her eyes settled on a route that had been used repeatedly in recent flights, she paused longer. That route curved around an area that offered no clear tactical advantage, did not help avoid fire, nor shorten response time. Sarah muttered, as if speaking to herself, "This route is unnecessary." The following day, during a brief exchange with her direct commander, Sarah mentioned it. She presented her point concisely, providing data and comparisons with previous options. The officer listened, did not study the map for long, and replied curtly that she should simply follow orders. The sentence was delivered quickly, as if the conversation had already gone further than he intended. Sarah nodded in acknowledgement, did not argue further, but in her mind, the question mark became clearer than before. The irregularities did not stop with flight routes. During a pre-mission technical check, Sarah noticed that several diagnostic devices on her Apache had been sealed separately. The seals were new, different from anything she had seen in standard procedures. She asked the technician in charge about it. He glanced around the hangar, lowered his voice, and said it was a requirement from higher up. When Sarah asked about the purpose, he hesitated for a second, then whispered, "Do not ask too much." The words were spoken quickly, but they were enough for Sarah to understand that this was not a routine technical matter. She began to pay closer attention to details she might previously have overlooked. Certain flight data were requested to be sent separately, bypassing the unit's general aggregation channel. Technical reports were split into two parts, one stored internally, the other forwarded under special orders. Whenever Sarah asked about the procedure, the answer was always the same: new directive, no further explanation needed. Each response sounded reasonable on its own, but when placed side by side, they formed a pattern that made someone familiar with systems feel uneasy. One afternoon, returning from a mission, Sarah passed by the meeting wing. The door of a conference room was slightly ajar, light spilling into the corridor. She intended to keep walking, but a fragment of conversation drifting out made her slow down. A low, cold voice stated clearly that this contract was worth more than an entire campaign. The way the speaker emphasized the word contract made Sarah stop short. In this environment, people spoke of missions, areas, risks, rarely of value framed that way. Another voice followed, quieter but urgent, saying that the shipment had to move within the week. The terminology used did not resemble how the military spoke about standard supplies. There were no mission codes, no coordinates, only shipment, contract, and deadline. Sarah stood still for a moment, clearly sensing the difference. This was not the language of war. This was the language of transactions, misplaced in the middle of an active base in a conflict zone. She continued walking without turning back, but those words followed her all the way to the technical area. In Sarah's mind, the pieces began to rearrange themselves. The unusual flight routes, the segregated data, the sealed equipment, and the meetings attended by only a select few. Each detail alone could be explained, but together they formed a blurred picture, still without a clear shape, yet unsettling enough to cause concern. In the days that followed, Sarah observed more carefully. She did not change her working habits, did not appear overly curious. On the surface, she remained an Apache pilot focused on her missions, completing her assigned tasks. But in rare quiet moments, she memorized flight schedules, cross-checked them with times when equipment received special inspections, and noted the names that repeatedly appeared in closed meetings. The instinct of someone who had flown many hours in dangerous conditions told her that the greatest threat did not always come from outside. Another technician, someone who had worked at the base for many years, once told her during a quick check of a secondary system that some things were better left unnoticed. Sarah asked why. He sighed and said that there were many things here that were not in the manuals, and people who asked too many questions usually did not stay long. The words were spoken gently, but they carried a clear warning. Sarah did not react immediately. She had grown accustomed to such warnings early in her career, but this time, the feeling was different. In the sky, risks came from gunfire, terrain, and weather. On the ground, risks came from opaque decisions and unspoken motives, and unlike gunfire, these things made no sound as they approached. During a review of an upcoming mission, Sarah noticed that her flight route had been adjusted again, slightly. Not much, just enough to pass through an area that had never been part of the plan before. She noted the change, did not object, but saved the data. As days passed, the list of things that needed clarification in her mind grew longer. She understood that if she stopped at suspicion, everything would pass as it had many times before. But if she dug deeper, she would step into a zone with no safe map. That night, when the base had grown quieter, Sarah sat alone in her small office. Maps, reports, and personal notes spread before her. She did not search for evidence hastily. She simply began by asking the right questions, the questions the system did not like being asked. Each question opened a new direction, and each direction led deeper into the shadowed area she had just touched. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. Once she stepped onto this path, there would be no simple way back. She could continue flying, complete her missions, and let those misalignments sink away as many others had done. Or she could investigate quietly, accept the risk, and face consequences she could not yet predict. The choice was not spoken aloud, but it was clear in the way she rearranged the documents on her desk. Outside, mountain winds swept through the base, carrying dust and the dry, cold characteristic of Afghanistan. The war continued in the air, and on the ground, loud and visible. But on another level, far quieter, a different war was beginning, where the weapons were information, and the danger lines were not marked on maps or by warning lights. Sarah stood up, turned off the light, and left the room. She knew she had just stepped into a forbidden zone, and from that point on, every step would need to be calculated as carefully as flight paths through deadly mountains and valleys. Nights at the Afghanistan base were rarely truly quiet. The distant sound of engines, wind sweeping through blocks of metal buildings, and pale blue security lights created a space that was always half awake, half asleep. In the small office assigned to the flight crew, Sarah sat alone in front of a stack of files rising nearly to the edge of the desk. The cold blue light from the screen cast onto pages she had reviewed again and again. She was not in a hurry. What she was looking for was not on the surface, but in the overlap between things that had been designed never to touch. Sarah began with the flight schedules. She opened each mission completed over the past several months, marking times, routes, and support objectives. Then she shifted to another set of files, the transport codes stored in the logistics system to which she still had access from the period when she had been grounded. At first, everything looked normal. Shipments were logged according to procedure, with no obvious irregularities. But when she placed the two lists side by side, a small detail emerged. One transport code appeared at the exact time she had flown a critical support mission. Then, another code, and another. Not all of them, but enough that coincidence was no longer a reasonable explanation. She circled those entries and added notes in the margins. Her support schedule was often watched closely, because the name Sarah Thompson had become a topic of conversation within the unit. The female Apache pilot was personally called by the Admiral, the one who passed an evaluation that many others had failed. Every time she took off, There were eyes following her, stories being embroidered further. Sarah had once believed that this was the price of recognition that came late. Now, she began to see it from a different angle. In a technical file, she discovered a handwritten amendment. The original line had been lightly crossed out and replaced with a different number, the ink inconsistent with the rest of the document. Sarah lingered on that page longer. Handwritten changes in a system that was almost entirely digitized were rare. She compared handwriting and cross-checked modification times. Everything had been done carefully enough to avoid drawing attention, but to someone accustomed to working with records, the misalignment stood out clearly. Sarah leaned back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling for a few seconds. "Not random," she said softly, as if confirming her own thoughts. The scattered pieces began to align. Irregular flight paths, data separated, testing equipment sealed off, and now transport codes overlapping with support schedules. Everything pointed to a guiding hand, not arranging things for tactical advantage, but to conceal another operation running parallel to the war. The following day, Sarah brought a simple question to a logistics officer who frequently appeared in closed meetings. She asked about the process of assigning transport codes to shipments accompanying support missions. The officer looked at her, smirked slightly, his tone carrying familiar sarcasm. "What does a pilot know about contracts?" The remark was delivered lightly, like a reminder that she was standing in the wrong place. Sarah did not react. She nodded, thanked him, and left. But that very response confirmed what she needed to know. If there had been nothing to hide, there would have been no need to be so defensive. Back in the office, Sarah continued digging deeper. She cross-referenced technical maintenance contracts signed during the same period as her flights. The company names were familiar, subcontractors that had worked with the military for many years. On paper, everything was legitimate. But when Sarah traced the technical data streams transmitted alongside those contracts, she realized the volume of information far exceeded what was required for routine maintenance. These data packages contained parameters related to Apache systems, carefully wrapped under harmless-sounding headings. The more she reviewed, the clearer her role in the picture became. The attention focused on her was not a side effect of achievement, but part of the plan. While people talked about the female pilot backed by the Admiral, while debates swirled around whether she deserved it, those shipments and data moved through the shadows, drawing little notice. Her support missions created the perfect noise layer, shielding other activities taking place right under everyone's nose. One evening, in the mess hall, Sarah overheard two soldiers talking about her. They mentioned the name Thompson with a mix of curiosity and admiration, saying that wherever she flew, things felt safer. Sarah sat not far away, listening without joining in. She understood that this image was being used as a curtain. She had become a story large enough to obscure more dangerous questions. Back in her quarters, Sarah sat before the pile of documents once more. She whispered, as if speaking to herself, "They're using me as smoke." The words echoed in the small space, unheard by anyone else. The bitterness did not come from being used, but from realizing that she had unknowingly become part of that game for a time. Sarah did not act hastily. She knew that any wrong step now could cause everything to collapse before the truth had a chance to surface. She began backing up data, storing it in a way only she understood. She documented carefully, leaving no unusual traces in the system. What she did unfolded slowly and steadily, the way she flew in bad conditions. There was no room for impulsive emotion. While reviewing an old technical file related to an Apache program that had been discontinued many years earlier, Sarah turned to a section thicker than usual. As she lifted the stack of papers, a thin object slipped out and landed softly on the desk. It was an old photograph, its edges worn, its colors faded with time. Sarah picked it up, her heartbeat slowing. In the pale blue light, the image of three men standing beside a helicopter came into focus. Sarah stared at the photograph for a long time, sensing a subtle shift in how she understood everything that was unfolding. She had not yet read the back, had not turned it over to see the words that might have been written years ago, but in that moment, she knew that what had fallen out was not merely a technical clue. It was a thread connecting past and present, and possibly the key to everything she was searching for. She set the photograph aside, closed the file, and sat still for a few seconds. The data, the numbers, the flight paths, and the transport codes were no longer a disconnected chain. They began to revolve around a different axis, deeper and more personal. Sarah understood that from this moment on, what she was doing was no longer simply a technical investigation. It would touch specific people, old decisions, and promises that might have been buried. Outside, the base continued operating as usual. Flights were scheduled, Meetings were held, and the war moved forward along its harsh trajectory. Inside that small room, Sarah had reached a point from which there was no easy return. She had seen enough to know that the truth existed, and enough to understand that exposing it would not be simple. If you have ever been turned into a tool for a dirty game, remember that every noise layer has its thinnest point. The next part is when the truth begins to strike back. The photograph lay still on the surface of the desk, but to Sarah, it seemed to be in motion. The pale blue light in the office washed the colors even further, yet the details remained clear enough to be unmistakable. Sarah picked up the photograph, her fingertips gripping it slightly tighter than necessary. She realized that her hand was trembling, very faintly, a rare reaction she failed to control in time. Throughout her flying career, she had grown accustomed to life and death moments, but this feeling was different, as if the sky had just collapsed inside the enclosed room. The man standing at the center of the photograph was her father. Much younger than Sarah had ever seen him in family pictures, with a lean face, a defined jawline, and eyes looking straight into the camera with a familiar calm. It was the same look Sarah saw in the mirror every time she had to make a difficult decision. Even though decades had passed, even though hair and wrinkles could change, that gaze had not. Sarah exhaled slowly, as if to confirm that she was not mistaken. Two men stood on either side of him, shoulders touching, their posture relaxed but not careless. They were not smiling, nor did they appear tense. It was the composure of people accustomed to the possibility of not returning. Sarah gently turned the photograph over, flipping it to the back. A handwritten line appeared, faded with time, but was still legible. One name stood out more than the rest: James Harlan. Sarah's heartbeat slowed, each beat distinct. The name was no longer unfamiliar. Admiral James Harlan, the man who had watched the recording of her flight, the man who had changed her fate with a brief phone call. Sarah looked again at the front of the photograph, then back at the name on the reverse. The coincidence was no longer a coincidence. It was a straight line stretching from the past into the present, one she was only now seeing clearly. Along with the photograph was a neatly folded letter, the paper yellowed with age. Sarah opened it very slowly, as if afraid of tearing something fragile and irreplaceable. The handwriting inside was tidy and decisive, identical to the administrative notes she read every day. There was no lengthy introduction, no overt display of emotion. The letter went straight to the point, in a cold and precise tone. Harlan wrote that the photograph had been taken before a final mission. He referred to Sarah's father by his full name, without honorifics. He wrote that before the helicopter lifted off, her father had entrusted him with something the military had no place to store. "He gave me an order." That sentence was written on its own line, without immediate explanation, as if the author knew the reader would pause there. Sarah continued reading, her eyes never leaving the page. Harlan wrote that it was not an order of rank, but of war. In situations the system could not fully record, those inside sometimes had to make commitments they were not permitted to break. Sarah's father had spoken to him about the child who had not yet grown up, about the possibility that he might not return. He asked Harlan, with all the calm of a pilot about to enter a dangerous mission that had happened, to ensure that the child would not be left behind by the very system they were serving. Sarah paused, set the letter down on the desk, and took a deep breath. She remembered growing up amid the silence surrounding her father's death. No one had lied to her, but no one had told her everything. The letter continued, its tone still dry, but its weight growing heavier. Harlan admitted that he had failed to fulfill that promise. He wrote that when the moment came, he chose the path that was safe for the system. He allowed everything to proceed according to procedure, letting a child grow up unaware that someone within the system owed her a responsibility. Sarah read more slowly toward the end. Harlan wrote that many years later, when he saw her name in the records, when he watched the flight recording in Nevada, he recognized what he had postponed for far too long. Not because she was her father's daughter, but because she had become a pilot in exactly the way that her father had once believed in. The letter did not ask for forgiveness, nor did it justify itself. It ended with a single short sentence, stating that some orders do not expire with time, but simply wait for someone capable enough to complete them. Sarah folded the letter again, very slowly. All the surrounding sounds seemed to recede. Recent events aligned themselves with a clarity that sent a chill down her spine. The unusual appearance of an unrecorded flight evaluation order, Harlan's gaze as he watched the flight footage, and the fact that she had become just visible enough to draw attention away from what was happening in the shadows. Harlan had not only seen a skilled pilot, he had seen an old promise, and perhaps an opportunity to make amends. Sarah sat still for several minutes, her hand resting on the folded letter. The emotions came, but they did not overflow. She was used to keeping emotion behind the facts, What mattered now was not the personal connection, but what was unfolding inside this base, with data being siphoned off and flight routes being exploited. The letter explained part of it, but it did not change the nature of the conspiracy she was facing. She looked at the photograph once more, then placed both the photograph and the letter into the file folder, more carefully than before. In Sarah's mind, a decision took shape with complete clarity, without any internal debate. If James Harlan was part of this story, then she needed to hear from him directly, not to seek an apology, and not to rely on any form of protection. She needed to know where he stood in the present, not the past. Sarah stood up and turned off the office lights. The blue glow vanished, leaving behind familiar darkness. She carried the file folder with her and stepped into the corridor, where the night wind of Afghanistan blew through narrow windows. She knew the upcoming meeting would not be simple. Facing an admiral was not the same as facing a mid-level officer. Every question would need to be placed precisely, and every answer could carry serious consequences. As Sarah walked back toward the living quarters, her steps were steady and even. The past had revealed itself beneath the rotor blades of the aging helicopter and the faded photograph. It did not slow her down. On the contrary, it placed everything in its proper position, and with that clarity, Sarah knew it was time to face James Harlan directly, not as a daughter, but as a pilot standing before a truth that needed to be brought into the open. The room was set deep within a sparsely traveled administrative complex, its walls painted a pale gray, no flags displayed, no insignia, no indication whatsoever that this was a place where meetings capable of altering many lives might take place. Sarah entered first, carrying a thin folder heavy with meaning. A few seconds later, James Harlan appeared and closed the door behind him. In that enclosed space, rank and legend seemed to be left outside. Harlan saw the photograph before Sarah had a chance to say anything. He stopped, picked it up, his eyes fixed on the familiar face, softened by time. He exhaled slowly, as if setting down a burden he had carried for too long. "Your father was a good soldier." His voice was low, unadorned, making no effort to soften the statement. It was a truth acknowledged belatedly. Sarah did not respond immediately. She observed Harlan, a man who had lived long enough within the system to understand the value of silence. Then, she spoke, her voice direct, without detours. "Did you put me on the Apache because I deserve it, or because you owe me?" The question was stated plainly, leaving no room for evasion. This was not an emotional confrontation, but a demand to define boundaries. Harlan placed the photograph on the table, his hands interlaced. He looked straight at Sarah. "Because of both." He said it without hesitation. Then he added, his tone still even, "But, if you did not deserve it, I would not have made the call." The statement was not a justification. It was his way of placing capability first, no matter how heavy the past might be. Sarah nodded very slightly, as if she had been waiting for that answer. She opened the folder and laid copies of data, flight routes, and transport codes on the table. "I did not come here to ask about the past," she said. "I came because of the present." She pointed to the documents, briefly explaining what she had discovered, without added emotion, without raising her voice. Every sentence was backed by data, every assessment cross-checked. Harlan listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished speaking, the room was silent for a few seconds. He looked down at the folder, then back at her. "Do you know what you are facing?" he asked. "This is not a few officers violating procedure. This is a structure that has existed long enough to protect itself." Sarah replied immediately, without thinking, "I know." Then she continued, her voice even clearer. "I will expose the truth." She paused for a beat, as if to ensure every word was heard. "If you block me, I will do it alone." The statement was not a challenge. It was a declaration of choice. Harlan looked at Sarah for a long time. His gaze was no longer that of an evaluator or a commander. It was the look of someone weighing the cost of silence against the cost of action. Finally, he nodded. "I will not block you," he said, "but you need to understand how to do it." He stood, took a few steps across the narrow room, then turned back. "No confrontation, no emotional accusations. We end this using the rules of the very system that enabled it." Sarah listened and committed his words to memory. Harlan continued, his voice growing sharper. He outlined how everything had to proceed by the book, step by step. Data needed to be sent through independent oversight channels. Irregular flight routes had to be forced through cross-check control points. Shady contracts had to be brought under the light of formal financial audits. "When everything is properly recorded," he said, "no one can dismiss it without leaving traces." Sarah asked one final question, her voice low but firm. "Where do you stand when this breaks?" Harlan did not avoid it. "On the side of the truth," he replied, "and I accept responsibility for letting it go on this long." The statement was not an apology. It was a commitment to his position in what was about to happen. The meeting ended without a handshake, without a written agreement. Sarah gathered the folder and stood. Before opening the door, she turned back. "I am not doing this so you can redeem yourself," she said. "I am doing it because if I do not, someone else will be used as a smokescreen." Harlan nodded again, slow and firm. "I know." When Sarah left the room, the corridor was as quiet as before, but within the system, a chain of movement had begun. Review requests were sent out with precise language. Records were backed up and distributed to the right places. Sarah's subsequent missions continued as normal on the surface, but behind the scenes, every flight now carried an additional layer of documentation, every route scrutinized by more eyes than before. In another office, people who were accustomed to quick signatures and closed-door meetings began to notice the change. Questions surfaced more frequently. Procedures were reiterated with greater rigor. No one was arrested immediately, and there was no noise. Everything moved forward like a machine that had just been recalibrated to miss nothing. Sarah kept flying, kept completing her missions. She did not act differently, did not try to warn or hint. That was the only way to keep the layer of interference intact, while the truth was guided to the right place. She understood that this was not a rebellion. This was an execution by rules, slow, precise, and irreversible once enough evidence existed. On a rare quiet evening, Sarah looked out at the runway, where Apaches were preparing for night missions. She thought of her father, of the faded photograph, and of a promise long delayed. Then she thought of the data being gathered, the signatures soon to be placed. The plan had been activated, without gunfire, without slogans. It required only time and unwavering resolve. Somewhere within the machinery, those who believed they were safe began to feel the ground beneath them shift, and Sarah knew that the decisive moment was drawing near, when the truth would no longer be something that could be negotiated. Sarah's subsequent flights appeared, on the surface, like every mission before them, the same preparation rhythm, the same familiar engine noise, the same flight paths traced between the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. But on another level, each flight was no longer merely a support or escort. Every altitude adjustment, every change in speed, every data packet generated by the Apache system was now recorded differently. Flight data was transmitted simultaneously to independent monitoring channels, no longer contained within a single chain of command. There were no public announcements, no new orders read aloud. Everything happened quietly, precisely, exactly as Harlan had said it would. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. She did not change her flying style, did not add unnecessary maneuvers, and did not try to leave a personal mark. She let the data speak for itself. Technical information packets were cross-checked, irregular routes were flagged, and overlapping time frames were circled. Somewhere, control systems began to register a rise in unanswered questions. No one spoke openly, but requests for explanations appeared more frequently, their language tighter and more deliberate than before. Shipments that had once moved through the shadows no longer passed so easily. Transport routes were intersected by new checkpoints, established strictly by procedure, sufficient to prevent any open objections. Familiar signatures began to be required again for confirmation. Certain files were held back for additional review. These actions did not create loud disturbances, but they slowed the familiar operational tempo, and that very slowdown caused those involved to begin losing patience. In a closed meeting, the voice of an officer rang out, barely concealing irritation. Who authorized the re-examination of this contract? The question was thrown like a challenge toward those holding the documents. Silence stretched for a few seconds, then the answer was delivered briefly, without further explanation. The Admiral. 2 syllables were enough to extinguish any further reaction. No one asked again, because everyone understood where that question would lead. Panic did not arrive immediately, but it seeped in gradually. Officers who were used to making quick decisions began to hesitate before signing. Meetings that had once been discreet became increasingly sparse. A few individuals tried to probe, to find out who had initiated all of this. There was no clear answer. Every trace led back to a legitimate process, activated with proper authority, at the correct time. The official investigation was opened without a press release. There were no dramatic arrests, no leaked images, only decisions are signed in silence. Several positions were temporarily suspended to serve the investigation. Names that had once seemed untouchable appeared in new case files, marked for deeper review. This time, the system could not pretend not to see, because everything had been placed under the light of the very regulations it claimed to uphold. Sarah continued flying throughout that period. She escorted convoys through familiar mountain passes and supported medevac helicopters under harsher conditions than before. Her teammates continued to rely on her as they had from the earliest days. No one asked her about the investigations, and she did not speak of them. In the air, she maintained the calm that had become her signature. On the ground, everything was changing in ways that did not require her presence. One afternoon, after completing a long mission, Sarah was informed that the flight she had just completed would be her last within her current assignment. There was no ceremony, no speech. The decision was delivered as part of a path that had been discussed long before. Sarah nodded in acknowledgement. She had been around long enough to understand that important endings were rarely marked by applause. The final flight took place under rare, stable weather conditions. The sky opened more clearly than usual, the mountain ranges gradually receding, as Sarah's Apache maintained a steady altitude. She checked each parameter with her familiar focus. The co-pilot beside her spoke little, but his gaze reflected the respect built over time. There were no dramatic moments, no unexpected situations. The flight unfolded exactly as it needed to. When the Apache landed, the landing gear touched down smoothly. The rotors slowed, dust rose, and then settled. Sarah shut down the engine, removed her helmet, and remained seated in the cockpit for a few seconds longer. She placed her hand on the control panel, feeling its familiarity one last time. Outside, no one stood waiting to congratulate or say goodbye. Her teammates were already busy with the next mission. That did not disappoint her. For Sarah, this silence was appropriate. She stepped onto the runway, handed over her equipment, and completed the final procedures. As she left the technical area, she looked back at the Apache that had carried her through the most significant years of her career. There was no sense of loss, only a clear sense of closure. She had finished her part. A few days later, additional disciplinary decisions were signed. Several cases were entered into official records, with careful language that could not be reversed. James Harlan accepted his share of responsibility in the relevant memoranda, acknowledging that he had allowed the situation to persist. He did not attempt to appear as a hero. He asked for only one thing, that the truth be recorded exactly as it had occurred, neither diminished nor embellished. Sarah left the military without a large farewell gathering. She packed her belongings, handed over what was required, and walked out of the base gate like so many before her. The Afghan sky that day was high and clear, the wind carrying the familiar fine dust. She paused briefly, looking toward the runway where other helicopters were preparing for takeoff. She thought of her father, who never returned, but left her a clear way of living. She thought of James Harlan, who had lived long enough to understand that some promises cannot expire simply because time passes, and she thought of herself, of the choices she had made, and the things she had missed to stand where she was. Becoming a veteran, for Sarah, was not about stopping. It was the moment when one begins to take responsibility for the choices made, and also for the choices not made when there was still time. She moved forward, carrying no title and needing no validation. The most important orders are not written in documents or read over the radio. They exist as a standard, waiting for someone steadfast enough to carry them out, even when the price is never small. If you believe that truth demands a cost, stay. Some orders never expire, and they always find someone to fulfill them when the time comes.